Hi everyone. So in this video, I'm going to cover another topic under the nervous system, which is the general senses. So this is the list of the learning outcomes. So please read it. So before we go into more detail of this topic, so let's take a look on a couple of the sensory terminology. So the first one is the sensory receptor. So sensory receptor are specialized cells that monitor a specific condition in the body or the external environment. So when sensory receptor is stimulated, the receptor will pass the information to the central nervous system in the form of action potential along the axon of the sensory neuron. Okay, the next one is the general senses. So we have at least 5 general senses. This includes temperature, pain, touch, pressure, vibrations, and all of these general senses receptors are being distributed throughout the body. So the next one is the sensory pathway. Sensory pathway will begin at the peripheral receptors and it will bring the information to the final destination within the central nervous system. So the arriving information is called sensation, while the conscious awareness of a sensation is known as perception. And the last one is the receptor field. So receptor fields are monitored by single receptor cell. So the larger the receptor field, the poorer your ability to localize a stimulus. So next, let's take a look on the categories of senses. So we have at least two types, or it can be divided into two. One is the general senses and another one is special senses. So in this video, I'm going to focus only on the general senses and I will cover the special senses in another video. There are 5 general senses and these include temperature, pain, touch, pressure, and also vibration. So let's take a look on the classifications of the general sensory receptor. So the first one, okay, is nociceptor. So nociceptor responds to the sensations of pain. Next is thermoreceptor, which responds to the changes in temperature. The third receptor is mechanoreceptor. This mechanoreceptor is activated when there is a physical distortion of the cell membrane. Number 4 is the photoreceptor, which is stimulated by light. And number 5 is chemoreceptor, which monitor the chemical compositions of the body fluid. So now let's discuss about nociceptor. So nociceptor is also known as a pain receptor. So this receptor can be or commonly found around your skin. Also, you can find it around the wall of blood vessel. So deep tissue and most visceral organ have a very few nociceptor. So the pain receptor are actually a free nerve ending with a large receptor field. So as I mentioned before, when you have large receptor field, this makes it difficult to determine the exact source of a painful sensation. So different nociceptor may be sensitive to 3 things. Okay, one is extreme temperature, second is mechanical damage, and the third one is the chemical. And all of these three types of receptor can all be activated following a very strong pain stimuli. So free nerve ending are the simplest receptor, and there are the tips of the branching dendrites of the sensory neuron. Okay, you can see this is what we call free nerve ending. So they are not protected by accessory structure, and most of this structure actually unmyelinated. So it responds to many different stimuli but have less specificity. So one example of the free nerve ending is the pain receptor. Okay, so the pain receptor is stimulated by chemical, pressure, temperature, or even trauma. So there are two basic types of pain. One is fast pain, second one is slow pain. So the myelinated type A fibers carries the sensations of the fast pain. So this sensation reach the central nervous system very quickly, and they often trigger somatic reflexes. So fast pain is usually associated with like deep cuts or pricking pain. Okay, next one is slow pain. Okay, the slow pain, the sensation reach the central nervous system slowly. Okay, so example that can trigger slow pain is actually burning or aching pains, and the slow pain sensation is carried by the type C fibers. So in slow pain, you become aware of the pain, but you can only have a general idea of the area affected. Because when you compare to the fast pain, you really know, okay, where is the place that give you the painful sensation. But in slow pain, you might just have general idea, not really know the exact location. So the next one is thermoreceptor, which is the temperature receptor. So thermoreceptor are free nerve ending, which are located in the dermis, skeletal muscle, liver, and also in the hypothalamus. So thermoreceptor are phasic receptor. So they are very active when the temperature is changing, but then they quickly adapt to a stable temperature. So for example, when you enter an air conditioning room, okay, from outside, which is quite hot, so the temperature change seems very extreme at first. Okay, you can really feel that suddenly you go into the cool temperature, but then after a while, when you sit in the classroom, you become comfortable, okay, thanks to the adaptations properties of the thermoreceptor. And coreceptor is 3 to 4 times more when you compare to the warm receptor, and there's no structural differences between these two thermoreceptor, okay, between the warm and the cold receptor. So chemoreceptor can detect small changes in the concentrations of specific chemical or compounds. So in general, chemoreceptor responds to water-soluble and lipid-soluble substances that are dissolved in the body fluid, like the interstitial fluid and blood plasma. So the chemoreceptor included in the general sensors do not send the information to the primary sensory cortex, but instead the arriving sensory information is routed to the brainstem center that deal with the autonomic control of the respiratory and the cardiovascular function. So the neurons in the respiratory center of the brain will respond to the concentrations of hydrogen ion and also the level of the carbon dioxide molecule, okay, in the spinal fluid. And a chemoreceptor can be found in the respiratory center of the medulla oblongata, carotid arteries, and also aortic arch. So mechanoreceptors are sensitive to stimuli that distort their plasma membrane. So this membrane contains mechanically gated ion channel. The gates can open or close in the response to stretching, compression, twisting, or other type of distortion of the plasma membrane. And there are three types of mechanoreceptor, which are the tactile receptor, baroreceptor, and proprioceptor. So now let's take a look on the three types of mechanoreceptor in a bit more detail. So the first one is proprioceptor, which monitor the positions of joints and skeletal muscle. They are the most structure and functionally complex of the general sensory receptor. The second one, which is the baroreceptor, that detect changes in the wall of blood vessel and in portions of the digestive, respiratory, and urinary tracts. So the third one is tactile receptor, which provide the closely related sensations of touch, pressure, and also vibration. So there are two types. Okay, the first one is fine touch and pressure receptor, which provide detailed information about a source of stimulation, including its exact location, shape, size, textures, and also movement. So this type of receptor are extremely sensitive and have narrow receptor field. While the other one, which is crude touch and pressure receptor, can provide a very poor localization. So they give like little additional information about the stimulus because they have large receptor field. So receptor can also be categorized based on the nature of their response of stimulation. So the first one is tonic receptor. So tonic receptor is a slow adapting receptor. They are always active and generate action potential at a frequency that reflects the background level of the stimulation. So when the stimulus increases or decreases, the rate of action potential generation changes accordingly. So here you can see in this picture, okay, when there is no stimulus, okay, or in the normal background, you can see there is an action potential being produced, okay, because tonic receptor is always active, so it will keep producing action potential, but the rate is just stable. But when there is a stimulus here, you can see there is an increase here, peak here, so the action potential is increasing, okay, and when the stimulus decrease, so it go back to the normal and still active. So that means tonic receptor is always active. Okay, the second one is the phasic receptor. So phasic receptor is a fast adapting receptor, which normally inactive but will become active for a short time when there is changes in the conditions that they are monitoring. Okay, so this is the picture showing that under the normal condition, so the phasic receptor is inactive. Okay, but when there is a stimulus, you can see the phasic receptor causing an increase in action potential. But because of the characteristic of phasic receptor is active for a short time, you can see they are trying to adapt, so no more action potential being produced. Okay, and then after a while, when there is changes again of the stimulus, the action potential is being producing again. Okay, so when there's no more stimulus, it will go back to inactive state. A reduction in sensitivity following a constant stimulus is known as adaptation. Or adaptation can also be defined as the diminished sensitivity to a stimulus as a consequence of a constant exposure to that stimulus. So the brain cells begin to fire when they pick up on a new stimulus in the environment as signaled by the sensory organ. So for example, the constant loud sound of a running air conditioner, for instance, seems to be irritating when it is first turned on. However, within an hour, you will most likely have forgotten all about that sound and no longer notice it. So if that stimulus remained unchanged in the environment, then the brain cells began to fire significantly less in response to that stimulus, and as a result, there is a lack of attention to that particular stimulus. So adaptation can be either peripheral or central. Okay, so the peripheral adaptations happens when the level of the receptor activity change. So the receptor respond strongly at first, and then the activity start to decline. Okay, so this type of response is a characteristic of a phasic receptor. So for example, a temperature receptor, okay, is one of the example of phasic receptor. So you seldom notice the room temperature unless it changes suddenly. Central adaptation occurs along sensory pathway within the central nervous system. Okay, central adaptation generally involve the inhibitions of a nuclei along a sensory pathway. So one example of the central adaptation is exposure to a new smell. So a few seconds after you have been exposed to a new smell, okay, the awareness of the stimulus will stop, okay, although the sensory neurons are still quite active. So there are 6 types of tactile receptors in the skin. So tactile receptor are the sensory receptor which responds to touch. So we're going to discuss all of these 6 types one by one. And here in this picture you can see the location of the 6 types of tactile receptor. So first we're going to talk about the free nerve ending. I have talked about the free nerve ending in the earlier slides, and I hope you still remember. So free nerve ending are the branching tips of the sensory neurons. Okay, so they are not protected by any accessory structures, and they are non-specific. So free nerve ending respond to many things, and this include touch, pressure, pain, and even temperature. Okay, a free nerve ending is the most common receptor in the skin. The root hair plexus monitor distortions and the movements of hair follicle. So when a hair is displaced, the movements of the follicle distort the sensory dendrites and produce action potential. Okay, so these receptors adapt very rapidly, so they are best at detecting initial contact and subsequent movement. Tactile discs are the fine touch and pressure receptor. So they are extremely sensitive tonic receptor with a very small receptive field. Okay, so the dendritic process of many nerve terminal that branching from a single myelinated afferent fibers make close contact with Merkel cells. Okay, Merkel cells is actually a large epithelial cells in the stratum of the basal of the skin. So each Merkel cells and nerve terminal make up the tactile disc. So next is tactile corpuscle, also known as Meissner corpuscle. So this type of receptor provides sensations of fine touch, pressure, and low frequency vibration. They adapt to the stimulation within a second after contact. So this receptor is abundant in eyelid, lips, fingertips, nipple, and also external genitalia. So tactile corpuscle composed of highly coiled and interwoven dendrites. Okay, and it's surrounded by Schwann cells. So a fibrous capsule surrounds the entire complex and anchors within the papillary dermis. So number 5 is lamellar corpuscle, or also known as Pacinian corpuscle. So lamellar corpuscle are sensitive to deep pressure. Okay, this type of receptor are fast adapting receptor. They are more sensitive to pulsing or high frequency vibrating stimuli. And lamellar corpuscle is a large receptor. Okay, it's very large receptor, and you can find these receptors in fingers, mammary glands, external genitalia, fasciae, joint capsule, and some viscera. So the last one is the bulbous corpuscle, also known as Ruffini corpuscle. So this type of receptor is sensitive to pressure and distortions of the deep dermis. Okay, example as when your skin is stretched. So these receptors are tonic receptor and show very little adaptation. So if you can see here in this picture, so we have a capsule that surround a core collagen fibers that are continuous with the surrounding dermis. So within this capsule, you can see that there is a network of dendrite, okay, which is intertwined with the collagen fibers. So any tension or distortions of these dermis will stimulate this dendrite and altering the activity in the myelinated afferent fibers. So this slide is showing the locations of all the 6 tactile receptors that you can find within the skin. So next, let's take a look on the somatic sensory pathway. So we have 3 major somatic sensory pathway. Number 1 is spinothalamic pathway. Second one is the posterior column pathway, and the third one is a spinocerebellar pathway. Okay, so this picture showing where is the pathway located. So spinothalamic pathway, there are 2 tracts. So number 1 is the anterior spinothalamic tracts, which carry the crude touch and pressure sensation, while the second one is the lateral spinothalamic tracts that carries pain and temperature sensation from the body. So this sensory homunculus, or meaning a little man in the brain, looks like a caricature showing that the relative size of cortex devoted to a particular body region that is proportional to the density of the sensory input received from that body region. So in this spinothalamic pathway, the axon of the first order neuron, which is the red arrow here, will enter the spinal cord and synapse with the second order neuron, which is the white arrow color here, okay, within the posterior gray horn. Okay, and please note that the axon of this interneuron actually cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord before ascending to the thalamus. So the third order neuron is synapse in the primary somatosensory cortex. So the second one, which is the posterior column pathway, this pathway carries sensations of highly localized touch, pressure, vibrations, and proprioception. Okay, this pathway, okay, will start from the peripheral receptor to the primary somatosensory cortex. So this picture is showing you the posterior column pathway. Okay, this pathway, if you can see, it begins at the peripheral receptor and ending, okay, it starts here, okay, and ends at the primary somatosensory cortex. And in this type of pathway, they do not cross to the other side. Okay, when you want to compare with the spinothalamic tracts. So the third one is the spinocerebellar pathway. So the cerebellum receives the proprioceptive informations about the position of skeletal muscle, joints, and tendons along the spinocerebellar pathway. So in this picture, you can see the spinocerebellar pathway. So the posterior spinocerebral tract contains axons that do not cross over to the opposite side of the spinal cord. And these axons reach the cerebral cortex by the inferior cerebral peduncle of that side. But in contrast, okay, the anterior spinocerebral tract crossing over to the opposite side of the spinal cord. Okay, so these are the two comparison between the posterior spinocerebral tract with the anterior spinocerebral tract. So one crossing over, but the other one does not cross over to reach the cerebral cortex. So this is the list of references. That's it for the general census topic, and thank you for watching.